Excellent. So, hello everyone, good evening. Oh, more remittances. That's the problem with trying to multitask.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, good evening. So good to see so many people joining us tonight in the digital sphere. So I'm Sarah Bowden, the curator and organiser of Hardwick Gallery in the School of Arts at the University of Gloucestershire. So before we start, I'd just like to run through the process of this evening's event. So after this short introduction, there'll be a discussion for around 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. We're going to keep audience cameras and microphones off during the event. And if you have a question for the speaker, please put it into the chat feature by clicking the tab at any point during the conversation. So the session is being recorded, and we recommend that you use Speaker View to view the event. Hopefully there'll be no glitches, but if there are, then just please bear with us. So this is Hardwick Gallery's first online event of this academic year. It's actually the first online event ever, so welcome and thank you for joining us. And it's surely not the last. Hardwick Gallery, as you may have seen, is temporarily closed and its physical programme suspended for the next few months. As a consequence, this has provided us with an opportunity to think and work in new ways. And I'm thrilled to welcome the artist Louise K Wilson as Hardwick Gallery's first artist at distance, working on a project that explores and interprets the special collections and archives at the University of Gloucestershire with the assistance of archivist Peter Morphew. Louise will be discussing the project this evening with theorist and lecturer across many disciplines at the university, Jean Boyd. So welcome both, and I'll hand over to you, Jean.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. And yes, welcome to everyone, and really absolutely delighted to be able to join you and Louise for our conversation this evening. I feel that it's really wonderful to be able to talk to an artist while their practice is in process. So, you know, there are many things about the Artists' Distance programme that are kind of allowing us insights into an artist's practice. So particularly things like the blog, if some of you have been checking the blog updates, these have been sort of bulletins from working with the archive. So the Artists' Distance project, which I think is really interesting in itself as a way of working, and obviously something we've improvised around our current circumstances, but actually I feel feels particularly interesting in relation to your work, Louise, because your work has often dealt with that idea of a kind of a relay or a transmission across a distance, whether that's a temporal distance or a spatial distance. And this feels very sort of pertinent to your inquiry as an artist anyway. So you do feel, it does feel to me that you are the perfect person to be taking up this residency for us. And archives have clearly always been resonant spaces for you. They've always been sort of forms of sort of construction site. And your proposal noted that this was an opportunity to continue an ongoing interest in the archive and the archival. So I wondered if you might start off by telling us a little bit about what you find to be so rich as a resource, really, about the archive, and how this perhaps differs your response to it as an artist, how that might differ to, say, a historian or a social scientist in their engagement with archives.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jean, and thanks, Sarah, also for the introduction. That's a great question. There's so many aspects to it. I suppose, first of all, I'd say that I don't exclusively work with archives. I'm very interested in proximity, actually. You mentioned at a distance, but there's something about my practice which has been very much to do with getting into places, and a kind of concern with I was going to say trespass. Sometimes it has been trespass, but sometimes, you know, an open door, about going into locations. And I suppose the archive, for me, I mean, when you mentioned about people who might access archives in perhaps a kind of particular academic way, I suppose I'm interested, as an artist, you can perhaps wear different hats, and there's perhaps a kind of nudging up against other disciplines. So, but there's a kind of freedom also. I mean, I'm obviously not a historian or an ethnographer or anything like that, but there is sometimes there's perhaps a kind of nudging up against those disciplines. So I'm interested in that access, that point of access, that point of freedom to work with the material. Of course, it's and maybe it's something we'll discuss later. I suppose I'm interested in the kind of ethics of doing that as well, about, you know, what it means to be working with an archive, particularly with this one, the University Archive, because as I think I might have said, you know, there's some of the people that I might be using images of or from may still be alive, and I don't know that. So there is a kind of interesting sense of who the people are in the archive that I'm looking into. So it's a very different sort of archive than I might have worked in before, where the material has a kind of older, you know, comes from a further point in history. So I'm very aware of that it, you know, where you know, how my responsibility or what that might be to the archive.
Mm. So would you like to say a little bit about maybe some previous work of yours that's used archives, maybe in other ways? You've just said that, you know, part of that has been perhaps looking at that point of access. Mm-hmm. And, you know, whether that's an invitation to work with particular materials, or you've had to actually seek out and gain that access, and in a way that's part of what's being revealed through the work.
Yes,
that,
yeah.
As you say, who gets close to the archive,
sure,
and who's kept at a distance.
Absolutely, and it just actually reminds me from what you just said that of course there's kind of archives which are personal archives, collections as well, and so previous projects have been, for example, I did a project years ago with ex-rocket men of the Blue Street Project, and that involved actually going into people's houses who had bits of rocket parts in their lounge under tables. So this kind of very strange sense of what an archive might be, and where it lives and where it exists. I'm just going to share the screen. I hope this is kind of relatively straightforward. I've got a few images that that I want to show from. I'm just going to start with this. I might show a couple of images and actually play a bit of video as well. I think this, in some ways, is probably one of the closest points of reference to this current residency, because this was in an archive that was a film archive, Northwest Film Archive at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I did this quite some time ago. But there's a kind of crossover in that there was very much this shared sort of thrill of exploring and getting in there and looking at lots of material and wondering about what is the process by which I can manipulate this, select, edit, make new narratives with it. So there is a kind of crossover. So I thought it might be a good one to start with. I've got two images, and I'm going to just play a little bit of video that came out of it. So, and again, we can talk about this, because the idea with this residency is that there is a series of outcomes that will emerge. It's very processual, whereas this residency built towards a single piece of work, which, you know, there was already an output or a kind of public-facing exhibition, which was going to be the BBC screen in Manchester city centre. So there was a kind of set period of time in order to get material and work with that. So it kind of emerged over the course of going into this archive, this film archive, which holds both professional and amateur film and video from the Northwest region. I became interested very much in the people who work there as well, similarly to this one actually. All those processes of conservation and preservation and manipulating the kind of matter of film. And that was fascinating to see all these old Steenbecks and old kind of technologies that were needed in order to transfer this lovely stuff of film from its current form into some digital version. So watching that and then recording. So a lot of what I did was actually recording, audio recording the sounds of these machines so they could be removed out of the archive. And then I also worked with some amateur filmmakers. Obviously, at the time it was sort of dying out, but there had been this incredibly vibrant amateur filmmaking community in the Northwest, people working with Super 8 and so on. And then a lot of their work had ended up in the archive. But now there was only, I think, one Super 8 filmmaking club left in the region. So I invited them to be part of it, to come in and for them to film the archivists at work. So it became a bit of a kind of sort of cycle or a circle. I'm just going to play a bit of the video that came out of it, which is called Euphony. So it's about 10 minutes. I'm only going to play a short extract from it. And just to introduce it, I think as I was watching all this stuff, hours and hours and hours of stuff, it started to remind me, and it happened quite quickly, it reminded me of Man with a Movie Camera, the Vertov film from 1929, which I don't know if people have seen it, but this is wonderful, rich day in the life of a city, although it's actually filmed in several cities in the Soviet Union. And then it's divided up into work activity, domestic life, you know, the vibrancy of the city. And the camera, it's called Man with a Movie Camera, and the man with the movie camera is very visible within the film. You see him filming, often quite active. He's on horseback, he's on trains, he's on buses. He's kind of visible throughout. And you also see Vertov's wife in the film. She's then spliced in the film, and she edited Man with a Movie Camera. So it's very self-referential. And there's a wonderful sequence at the beginning of Man with a Movie Camera where you see, and I'm just going to play this. So yeah, so the shots were selected to reference various moments of Man with a Movie Camera. I'll just let it play for a couple of minutes. I'll just leave that there. So there was some quite vital information I neglected to say. I hired a brass band and they played at Exchange Square. So they were providing some of the music, which was then sampled by some musicians called Soviet France who then worked some of these recordings plus the archive recordings to make this soundtrack. So it very much references the first few minutes of Man with a Movie Camera, where the orchestra assemble in the theatre house and then they watch the film. So it's all, as I say, very kind of self-referential. And then playing with some of the kind of temporal effects that Man with a Movie Camera does, used of slow motion, used of speeding up footage and so on. There are other kind of archive pieces I can talk about, but I don't know whether you want to know more about those at the moment, or whether we can come back.
Well, perhaps we can pick up on, I mean, there's so many things out of that you know, I'm going to have to try and hold in my head so that we can maybe kind of come back to. But perhaps picking up initially on that way that the artist might, and yourself in particular, might work with the archive, in that sense that there is a kind of a consciousness of that manipulation, or that not necessarily manipulation, but again, a kind of relay between yourself and those processes of archiving and processes of choosing, so that we're actually aware of the artist's presence, perhaps in the work, a little bit like the Man with a Movie Camera, who, you know, we see him filming, but we also obviously we see him being filming, so that you say we have that kind of relay going on. And, you know, I wondered whether you might see the way that you work with the archive is that perhaps your presence sets up a kind of almost like a sort of diffractive pattern across those materials, or a sort of maybe a kind of interference in what that material might be attempting to transmit in quite a transparent way. You're perhaps making us conscious of that materiality, that time, that process of sort of transmission.
Yes, that's a great question. I'm going to kind of come at it slightly sideways, because I think obviously the key difference to some of the archival residencies I've done, like the Thackeray Museum, Medical Museum in Leeds, Science Museum in London and so on, is that I'm not able to get into this archive. So any sort of diffraction pattern, which is a lovely image, everything is done through a gatekeeper, who is Peter, who is the Special Collections University archivist. So, you know, it was because I did wonder early on, am I going to be allowed to get into the archive? And I keenly wanted to, and then realized that wasn't going to be possible. It possibly could have been if I'd really fought for it, but it presents a lot of difficulties for Peter, in that anything I handle then has to be quarantined for 72 hours, etc. And actually, Peter was quite clear, and I agree with him, that actually it would go against the grain of this residency if I actually physically got in. So the archive itself and the content become quite mythological, in that I can't physically get into it. I can only imagine what the space of the archive is. And then, so that's one side of it, which I've become quite interested in. In fact, today, looking at the internet, I didn't even know what the outside of the building was, and I was disappointed that I've now seen this image, because I have this, you know, I've constructed this image of what the building and what the archive is within what building, you know, and it's quite a kind of fabulated version of itself. But then Peter, you know, this is quite surprising to me. He's become this extraordinary person who I've never physically met, but we have this kind of these different sort of levels of dialogue about how I can make requests and he can get material to me and so on. And that also, and the first blog entry sort of details that, you know, the first time that I visited the archive was Peter walking around with a laptop giving me this guided tour. And that's really set the tone for things subsequently. It's quite funny, Peter didn't want to be photographed, so I've just got, you know, he's just there tangentially as a pair of hands holding up various kind of volumes in front of the camera. So I realized that was going to be actually quite important. It wasn't this unmediated, unfettered access to the archive. It was going to be completely through Peter, his time, what time he was going to give me, which has been very generous. But also how he might interpret what I want to get access to. And he's made recommendations. He's also an artist, so I think that's very important to note. So, which is interesting, because then he's quite, I don't have to sort of argue to do certain things. I can suggest things which might feel a bit odd to ask another archivist, which I'll cut, sounds a bit odd, but things that I was wondering about whether it'd be possible to do, but he's obviously kind of got it because he's an artist as well.
But I feel that there is a absolute presence of yourself and your engagement with the archive and the archivist that's very present in the work, and is so interesting to read about on the blog, to kind of see how that process sort of unwinds, and the almost like the points of almost not tension, but almost how you cope with that distance, how you cope with the constraints of that, of which the idea of armchair travel or time travel, again, it's dealing with those kind of constraints and trying to overcome them through imaginative means, so kind of imaginative leaps. But I think it's also very interesting that normally we might find that the presence of the archivist is somewhat obscured in our encounters with the archive. The archivist is behind those scenes, so that if we just go and work with an archive ourselves, we may not be so conscious of that sort of intervention. But here I think we're very conscious of Peter's, what you described as his purposeful collecting.
Yes,
it's purposeful, yes. Isn't it? Very decisive, and that in a way he is the personifies in a way the apparatus of the archive.
Yes, I mean that's a good point. I think there's a few things. I mean, it's interesting, I suppose, in fictions the archivist is often painted as a particular sort of character. So I'm thinking of the Polyakov's Shooting the Past, where the archivist, which is about a photo library, I think, which is due to close. I think it's a TV film or play, and you get that very strong sense of the archivist as this absolutely encyclopedic body of knowledge. A bit like sort of Fahrenheit 451, that they contain, not just one book, they contain the whole archive in their head. And I've actually found that in the Northwest Film Archive. You would ask and there's multiple archivists there, you'd ask them a question, they don't need to go to the database, they just know, and they can tell you where to find things. So yes, there is a kind of controlling aspect as well, but I think Peter was just being mindful of the time. The residency is limited. It was September to the end of December. There's a short amount of time. He has a short amount of time. There's obviously, lots of questions around copyright and so on. And if I'm going to be posting this sort of on a blog, then I there isn't the time to kind of fight and try and procure access to copyright. So he did sort of nudge me, well, more than nudge really, just really suggested that I just work with one small, well, I say small, it is quite a large section of the archive, which is the Chelt volumes, which is the University of Gloucester's own archive. Because that would, I mean, a number of things I think were interesting for that. One is that perhaps it's less known. The archive, Special Collections, has some kind of fantastic poetry archive, so artist books. I mean, there's some things that I would love when this is all over, I'd love to come and visit and look at separately. But the Chelt volumes, they haven't necessarily been even documented fully. I don't know how much they have been opened up and used. So there was something really nice about it also being a useful reciprocal side of it, in that Peter could go in and document, and then they could be made available for others as well. So there was something useful to me as being a sort of catalyst in procuring that access sort of long term.
And there's a kind of active archiving process in that it's also a catalyst for the archivist to, in a way, reformat. So there's that sense of transmitting and translating, so that material can travel, travel remotely to you, that can travel at a distance.
That's right. I mean, there's something quite, there was something quite kind of interestingly apocalyptic about it, because, Peter was talking about being locked out of the archive and then being allowed in. So that, again, that sort of fed into an image of this archive as this kind of room of stilled air where the archivist comes in and kind of ruffles the atoms in the air and it becomes energized again. Probably over embellishing it, but I quite like that of, you know, the coming in, the shaking it up, and then making it available. And because he was working quite quickly, the photographs were quite rough, and I actually quite liked that. I was starting to make a list for him to go back and document them more carefully, but actually I like the fact that you know, that they're, you know, you can see the page, they haven't been nicely flattened out, the light falls on the photograph, and so on. So you've got a sense of that transaction, very much so, in his documentation. So it's not sort of you know, full archival quality if it was going to be used in some sort of, you know, particular reproduction scenarios. But I like the fact that it speaks to that his agency, his use of time, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a, you know, there's a texture to that that becomes sort of tangible, and you know, I mean, obviously within an archive, what can be archived is limited by the, you know, the object itself, and but also by the means of its documentation. So what becomes available via that means of documentation. So here, where the, you know, the scrapbooks of the Cheltenham folders there, and those archives, how those need to undergo a process of digitization. You know, that, like, again, the hand, you know, he has to scan them, he has to photograph them, then he has to send them to you, and you go through a process of working with that material. In, you know, there's a labor involved there, a labor to kind of transmit that material, that I think is really interesting, that this project is making visible as well.
Yes, I mean, he said recently, and I've used it in the blog entry today, that he reckons he must have, I can't remember the sheer amount of gigabytes that he reckons he's now sent to me, but he reckons about 3,000 images, photographic images, I've now received. So I've just, you know, obviously there's something about the sheer quantity of that stuff, and where I go next with it. But yes, you're exactly right. There was something fascinating to me, and it's become quite important about this kind of chain of the materiality, the volumes being photographed, digitally arranged, uploaded to Dropbox. I download them, I store them, and so on. And then wanting to turn them back into materials again. So I did have this thought that I could then recreate the archive in this room. You know, I could then print everything out, kind of arrange it, put it on a kind of stack system, and I would have my very own Chelt volume archive. I don't think it's going to happen, but I liked it as an image, and also about the idea of kind of trying to get back into a dark room, something I hadn't really thought about. You know, for the first time in decades, I would dearly love to get in and actually print and have you know, the kind of fumy, you know, Proustian moment of the chemicals. But actually, that's proving difficult. I know that there's things that you can do, kind of recreate, making your own dark room with kind of coffee. So I might even look into that to see if there's a kind of very low tech dark room that I can make as well. But
so it's interesting that sort of you know, that process of and some of the inadequacies, the trying to overcome that distance and that lack of tactility of you know, rummaging in the archive, that in turn sort of makes you think about looking again at those processes, those material processes by which, you know, that material kind of gives rise to an image.
Yes, I mean, it's something that I haven't really, I mean, I feel like I've only really just started, because I think it's been a long time actually just looking through material and coming up with my own cataloguing system, if you like, for the archive. But that was something that was very clear for me in the original proposal, and it's something I haven't yet really started yet, but I really want a very strong kind of relational aspect to this, involving other people, you know, around Gloucestershire, or maybe users of the libraries, of the university, and so on, to play an active part in kind of speaking to that idea of tactility. It's tricky not to make it sound a little bit kind of naff, I suppose, but I suppose it harks back to kind of lockdown and the kind of rise in cooking and gardening and walking and all those sort of very sensory embodied activities. But there was something about you wanting to use the archive as a way to kind of tap into that and collect some of those kind of ingredients, if you like. So I was kind of been purposefully looking through the archive of the Chelt volumes to find, I suppose, touchstones that might help in pursuing that as an activity. Things like music. I've actually found very little. So one idea is almost looking for the gaps. There's a few pages where maybe photographs have fallen out or something's missing, or there's a strange kind of composition on the page. And I feel that's the space where I can kind of rush in and kind of fill it with things that that are missing.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things there that are about different forms of expertise and how that's transmitted, right through from what you were saying about the Manchester archives and, the kind of the knowledge that's transmitted. And almost that's like a lost archive, isn't it? That personal knowledge, all the way through to, your processes or Peter's processes of choosing, and then your processes of choosing and selecting. And all of those are archival actions, aren't they? They're kind of archival activities that you're undertaking, even if you're perhaps kind of diverting some of those things by looking for the missing object. So looking at maybe for almost you were touching on there, for the forms of knowledge which tend to be transmitted in a more personal, domestic setting, whether that's a recipe that's passed down, or you mentioned before about knitting patterns and those kind of, they're forms of knowledge, aren't they, that are transmitted by those items. But often, there's often many aspects of sort of everyday knowledge that aren't necessarily captured by an archive. So there's, the ordinariness of life and kind of lived experience, rather than the event that opens itself up to capture by the photograph, for instance, that you would photograph that because that's an event.
Yes, that's a really good point. And I mean, I think a lot of those other kind of lived experience aspects, as you mentioned, I think they are there in the archive, in other sections of the archive. But in the Chelt volumes, there is and obviously we're talking about a large span of time, I think from about 1886, that's the first one I've got, up to about mid-1950s. It's a large span of time. But they start to kind of not be generic, but there's a certain recurrence of certain kind of tropes, or, like sporting events, theatre productions, music events. So they're events that are there to be documented and to be kind of stored and archived for the future. There's very much that sense that, these are kind of yearbooks for the college at the time. So anything that might be more incidental doesn't necessarily find its way into there overtly. So I suppose I'm seeing this is now probably what I can do, is kind of see what can be nudged in or kind of,
made present.
Yes.
Additionally, because I mean, obviously with photography, we would understand that as a really kind of key archival mechanism of the world as it has been archived through photography is already familiar to us. And again, I feel that what you are perhaps doing is looking at what might just be out of view of the camera. So whether that's a sense of duration, so often working with kind of multiple images, and I'm very interested in the way that you've started working with the images of the Doll's House play, as obviously something that was going to unfold in front of an audience through time, and working with that set as a sort of spatial construction. And then we have those moments in time through the play that may not be in the right order. We might be moving backwards and forwards, but there's a sense of trying to somehow conjure up or make manifest the kind of what the camera couldn't quite capture, or and that's where the sound is a way of bringing in an additional form of sensory proximity to those images.
Yes, no, that's great. I mean, it actually started, if I kind of go back a bit and how that came about, and it came out quite quickly. I was really interested in not just that particular theatre production, because there have been quite a few in the archives. I was just interested in the postures of the actors, because these are obviously amateur actors, and there's something kind of wonderfully wooden about those kind of, the grand gestures and the slightly looking a bit awkward on the stage kind of gestures that I was interested in. And I'm just going to show you these. These are really terrible. But I started making these little kind of cutouts, because I was thinking it was going to be an animation, and because of bad kind of printing, they started to dematerialize, and they almost look like sort of Star Trek characters who were beaming up and materializing somewhere else, and then I sort of turned them into the backdrop of the play, and then it came basically. So for people who haven't seen the blog entry, it was a production of Doll's House, Ibsen's Doll's House, that was performed, I think, in 1956, somewhere around there, 57, I think, and there's only 5 photographs. So the photographer is always standing roughly in the same place, but not exactly. So the entire film, the entire play, 3 acts of it, is just reduced down to these 5 photographs. And yeah, it was suddenly the stage set became really important, rather than just concentrating on the postures of the actors. And going back to the original play and looking at the very, very clear instructions about the furniture and where it's positioned. And the furniture became crucial, because then I could, in Photoshop, I could try and layer these up and resize the images and just try and get them to map onto each other. So that became a kind of interesting activity. And then I was researching, and I wasn't familiar with Doll's House. I obviously heard of it, but I've never seen it performed or anything. And I think just becoming really fascinated just about, about the proscenium arch structure. I haven't been to a play for so long. So that was really interesting, just to think about that the opening up of that space, this domestic space, as a stage set. There's one piece of music in the play, a tarantella. There's a character in Act 2, and she's rehearsing for a costume party on Christmas Eve, and it's played on the piano, a tarantella. And I just thought, well, I was thinking, I wanted some sort of audio, and I just thought, well, maybe it should be, try and get some tarantella. Asked a couple of friends, and they, I really wanted to go to their house and record it, because they live locally, and I thought, obviously I can't go into their house, maybe I could stand outside their window with my recorder and just let the sound sort of waft out the window. But anyway, that wasn't to be. So they very kindly recorded several versions of it on a flute and desktop recorder, and then gave me that to kind of work with. So then it was about, well, how can I sort of try and animate? What are the gaps between? What are the spaces when you cross dissolve between 2 images, and you've got that kind of beautiful, delicious moment when you've got a kind of ghosting of moments, and the characters just seem to disappear into the background. And then, as I mentioned, I've always been kind of enthralled to La Jetée, and that moment where the beautiful moment of stillness in the middle, towards the end of the film, where it goes from still images into moving image. I don't quite know how that relates. I know it sort of obviously does on some levels, but it was just something that I was reminded of. And I suppose it's throughout this project, it is this idea that something in the archive just sparks off a memory, it sparks off a book or a film or something, it becomes a touchstone to want to go and revisit something else. And so, yeah, and that's been a kind of interesting thing. I thought it would happen, but surprised to what extent it has happened. That's a very long answer, but
again, touches on so many things that I think we have so little time to unpack. really. But you know, again, I think it's quite interesting that you've chosen, you know, you've been drawn to the Doll's House as the play, where we have, you know, as a theatre audience, you know, we can imagine that, you know, we're traveling somewhere else. Mm-hmm. By being present and they're looking at the stage, but also for the scenario of the play. Mm. All of that is unfolding in this very constrained domestic space, which is clearly, you know, been very carefully kind of spatially choreographed. Mm-hmm. and that's been very carefully kind of designated. So again, we are moving around all of the themes of that play, but within a constrained space, which again feels very, very resonant with our current circumstances.
Yeah. Yes,
how to move beyond the constraints of that space. I loved your comment about, you know, printing out the little figures and how they seem to be materializing somewhere else. And I'd say that's actually a very good way of describing what you're doing with the archive, is you're taking part of that archive and sort of beaming it somewhere else where it sort of semi-materializes, but just sort of shimmers, you know. There's that sense that maybe we can't quite grasp it and it might elude us. So I think that's rather wonderful. Those resonances in the work.
Jean, is that a good point for me just to come in for a moment and remind people, and also to let people know that joined a little later, to please feel free to leave questions and observations in the chat part of the screen. So if you just click on the chat button there, then you can leave a question or an observation, and we'll read those out. But perhaps you might have another question or so while people are just composing their
questions together.
Yes.
Okay, well, perhaps I suppose my I mean, I have so many questions, Louise, still to ask you, but I suppose one that might be interesting for us to hear about is maybe something of the, you know, you talked about this project being quite a processual project. So you had a number of strands that you began with, and there's a number of things that are emerging from the project so far, the documentation of the project through the blog. Again, we're seeing this project unfold, and that feels as if we are, you know, we're being invited into that process. And I wondered whether you might hint at some of the things that are emerging now, which are maybe even diverting you away from elements of the proposal, or maybe are developing specific elements of the proposal.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I mean, there was sort of three areas in the proposal. Briefly, there was this idea of armchair travel, of using pictures of other places to go on a journey. And that's sort of been hinted at in one of the second blog, where I was talking about the images of Bath. And by chance, I went to Bath exactly this time last year. So it just reminded me of that. And Bath reoccurs, obviously proximity to Cheltenham and so on. So there was that. There was this providing soundtracks for the images. That's something I haven't quite embarked on yet, but I'll be looking to do that. Obviously with the music was a first sort of stab, but wanting to kind of open that up to other people as well, to find about ways to provide soundtracks. One thing that surprises me, that will be quite a large part of it, is a kind of burgeoning interest in animation, which I hadn't really, I've never really worked with before, even though I put it in the proposal, even though I haven't actually done any. And I've got myself a graphics tablet and just learning how to use that. So I think that thing of kind of animating the archive, I hope it's not too much of a cliche, but it's something that I'm now feeling quite excited about, the different forms of animation that I could use. So whereas I suppose sound has always been probably one of the most sort of central aspects of what I do, I'm not sure it's not necessarily going to be the most important one. And yeah, just wanting to, as I say, kind of doing experiments with materiality of photographs. I want to kind of test them to destruction. I've got this thing about getting some photographs and just using light to kind of eat into them. And so I need to sort of research how I can do that. Involving other people. Peter was very kind, actually, as a collaborator. As I said, that this kind of collaboration with Peter has, if it's okay, I'm just going to share the screen and show a couple of images that he's very kindly given me. Oh, not this one. I need to get onto the PowerPoint. Sorry about this. Okay, so I don't know where this came from. I'm just going to whiz through these. I'm not going to show these now. Oh, here we are. I just imagined there was something about Peter being in the archive, and because it always looks a little bit like a bunker, because I don't know if there's any natural daylight, but it's always seemed to me like some sort of little kind of panic room. So I just imagine what it would be like if I could instruct Peter to spend the night in the archive. I suppose there's something about those spaces that seems to be the stuff of films, of just being amongst all this stuff and letting it get into your dream state somehow. So I asked Peter if he could go in and photograph the archive at night. Obviously there's kind of technical issues to do with photographing a space like that in darkness anyway, but he kind of rose to the challenge, and he's been coming up with these really beautiful images of kind of views through the archive shelves and kind of constructing it as a different sort of space. So you get that kind of lateral or those horizontal views through the stacking systems where just a little bit of light will kind of illuminate some of the labels and so on. And this one is wonderful. If you can read that, it says from crime murder to crime murder. So I'm really fascinated what that box of stuff is. But it just seems to sum up this archive as a kind of site of something, and being a little bit awry. So I really was thrilled when Peter's just sent me this zip folder of 150 images that he'd taken. It just came out from a little bit of a conversation about what would it be like to spend the night in an archive? And then I've got this stuff, which I'm now going to kind of work into a bit of a narrative. So I think this idea of writing has become quite important. It's not something I've kind of used, but I think it will actually become quite a main feature of kind of thinking about narratives that can be written up.
And then we're in this lovely tension, aren't we, between the database and the narrative. So something that can be unfold it as a piece of writing, unfold as a narrative, and that idea of sort of database behavior where we choose and we select and we reorder. I mean, we've kind of, in a way, we've almost run out of time to talk about. I was particularly interested in the archival search terms that you were starting to work with. Maybe we have a chance to hear about that, but I can see that Bridget's asked a really interesting question, asked you to say a little bit more about the ethical issues that archives raise, which maybe are always latent within our use of archives, but this is perhaps we become conscious of it when, as you say, we have living people whose materials you might be working with, but whether that same ethical issue actually extends equally back into the past is perhaps something we consider slightly less.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Bridget. And I think, and I know this sounds an appalling admission, but it's something I haven't really, well, maybe not consciously been thinking about so far. I suppose, and it's perhaps that I've almost been thinking that, and go back to Peter again, but maybe because of this kind of mediation of material, that somehow lets me off the hook. But of course it doesn't, and I do have a responsibility to be careful with material. I mean, it's a really complex one, and it's something that again was flagged up early on when Peter was giving me this guided tour. That there is some of the material in the archive which is of its time, as he put it, or racist. We might actually kind of more legitimately say, some of the images in the archive of blackface and so on are, you know, really quite problematic. So there's material that I really don't feel equipped or, you know, would want to make reference to. So I am cherry picking and then using it. The archive, it's interesting actually, the names and addresses are listed in the volumes as well. So I did wonder if I could even try and see if I could find out who the relatives might be, but I'm not sure to what end or what necessarily would be the point of it. But yes, I think there is a responsibility to be careful with what I do with the material, that it is respectful, and you know, hope it can be playful as well. But yes, I can't kind of distort it or be too. Yeah, I just need to be careful. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Bridget, did you want to come back with a comment or extend that question a little further? Or maybe Bridget's content with your answer.
I had a bit of a question, and I'm not sure that it's properly formulated, but the Chelp volumes, they extend from 1886 to 1958. So I'm kind of wondering, to what extent is that a kind of incomplete project, or to what extent are you in this project speaking to a future researcher, or you know, a kind of future artist? I know there was a point that we were talking about earlier on in the project where you came across an entry where someone had directly spoke to you kind of into the future, didn't they, from one of the kind of entries. So I mean, I've got a couple of questions. What happened in 1959? I mean, why did it end? I'm kind of quite interested in what happened, and whether or not there was a sense that it wasn't relevant or important anymore. But whether or not it has any relevancy or value to kind of starting up that project again. Kind of what you think about that idea.
It's a really interesting question, and there are missing years as well within that you know, that span of time as well. So there are a few years, and I don't know whether that's just they're not existing or that Peter hasn't sent me them, because I think originally he said that they started at 1879 and I've only got 1886 onwards. But you're right, I don't know that. There isn't, I suppose that's the kind of beauty and the frustration with this, because there isn't an easy reference book that I can find, or a historian that admittedly I haven't really made much of an effort, but I don't know if there are any historians that I can readily find who might be able to give me that information about why it stopped, and you know, what the culture was at the time. Was this something unique to these colleges? Was it something, you know, that was prevalent in, you know, in other similar colleges, you know, at the time? I don't know, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting actually whether there is something there to think about. What would be the 1959 one, or the 1981, or the, you know, what were they replaced by? Why did they stop? Could they be resuscitated, and what form would they take?
And I wonder now whether it's unlikely that it would be full of theatre productions and sporting achievements now, and I'm kind of wondering how much of the real world might kind of seep into a current, you know, a current Chelp volume. I mean, obviously with the pandemic, I mean, that's kind of most likely it would, but
I think they'd still be support.
Probably, but I mean, there was the kind of, if you think about what happened between the years of 1886 and 1958, there was probably a lot that wasn't captured by those archives, the wars and the colonial projects and all of that stuff that's just kind of absent from those volumes.
Yes, that's true. And I mean, one thing that I have barely scratched the surface of it is the writing. You know, they are majority written. It's quite difficult to read. It's handwritten, obviously, in a very particular script. And that's something I want to kind of investigate and look into. But so I've really just been skimming off the visual stuff. But yeah, what kind of might lie within and there's a lot of storytelling as well, you know, lots of stories. So it will be interesting to kind of, go to particular momentous years and just see how might that be encoded within the writing or the imagery at the time. But yes, you can look at, there's not the wartime ones. I don't think there's anything, maybe Peter, I can see Peter there now, but maybe there is, there's not a great deal that actually points to what was, you know, happening in the country at the time, strangely.
So there's a question here from Carrie, who's asked, do you think virtual archives can replace physically experiencing archives?
What, for me or in general?
I guess for you, or maybe both, I don't know.
Virtual archives. I mean, I suppose it makes things a lot easier. You know, archives, I suppose, like British Library or somewhere, you've got that time-consuming ordering the book, waiting for it to be come along on the trolley and all that sort of thing. It's a lot quicker to access. Yes, of course, you're missing the lovely kind of smell and texture of the document itself or the artifact itself. So that's missing, and I used to love using the library at Wellcome Institute in London, where you'd kind of order up a book and it would arrive, and you'd kind of put it on this beautiful sort of little altar piece of a foam pillow to look at it. There's something about that ritual of getting this precious thing, putting on gloves and opening it up. And when I did the piece at the Thackeray Museum, that was, for me, was one of the most beautiful parts, was being trained on how to handle these precious objects, you know, all the rules of object handling. So sorry, this is probably a bit of a roundabout way of answering that. They may translate, sorry, there's a second part to it. The virtual depends on limited senses, perhaps. Yes, exactly. It's possibly more just about transmitting the information, but it's not giving you, as you say, that it's only a partial. But it's what you want from it, you know. But I'm missing the sensory stuff.
So Peter here has also said that there's some new a new accession of Chelt volumes, I think he's saying. So even though that there are gaps, there are definitely gaps, but there's possibly some new volumes have recently arrived. So
fantastic.
Okay, so perhaps we, if there's any more questions that anyone has, then please get them written down and into the chat now. Jean, did you want to?
Well, I don't know that I
come
can
back.
Just try one more question, really, which is perhaps that the nature of archives. In order to search them, we have to use those search terms, but those search terms have pre-existed our act of searching. So the search term always points forward to the searcher, to the one who will be wanting to retrieve. And the archivist then, in a way, has to choose those search terms in order to enable those future searches. But what those do is those both channel very specific routes through the material in ways which, you know, direct you. But I think it's interesting then coming back to that, as in your interest in the search terms, how the search term itself becomes a form of almost, you know, hypertext, it might have been called, something that allows us to leap from one thing to another, one time and one space, so that we've got something that both channels and allows those sort of leaps sideways, which I always think is a great sort of point of tension and interest about the archive and the search term.
Yes, good point. I mean, obviously I'm not using search terms, or there isn't anything that I'm using in order to, you know, it literally is just loading the pages up in preview and scrolling through and then looking more closely. It's just kind of going straight in without that, but which is great in a way, because then I'm not being hoodwinked by search terms. But yes, I remember when I did the Northwest Film Archive one, that was how I would, when I had that project about this was what I was going to do in terms of this remake of a section of Man with a Movie Camera. Then I needed stuff. I needed like a funeral. I found one, which I showed that clip of, and so on. So the database was extremely useful for doing that. And then I became fascinated by the poetry of the description. Obviously, this is moving image work, you know. So how can it be written in the most straightforward, objective way, you know, in terms of describing very minimally what's on that tape. So yes, I really enjoyed the kind of banal poetry of the descriptions. But yes, it just made me think, because I have the, you know, the limitation, which is quite joyful as well, of just these shelf volumes. And as I said, a lot of the images are, you know, sports, theatre, a lot of kind of portraits, you know, class portraits and so on. You know, is there another kind of cheeky way that I can come up with my own search terms? So I put some in the blog entry today, because there's some quite beautiful stains on the Chelt volumes. You know, maybe if people wanted to just look for stains in volumes, or if they wanted to look for signs of the occult, I'm sure we could probably find those in the background of some of the sporting images. There's a ridiculous amount of images in the earlier ones of a kind of beautiful women drawings. So that's been quite strange. And then caricatures of men, lots of animals, dogs. There's a whole sequence on frogs. They're quite random. So yeah, I'm kind of coming up with these that will be part of my own. This is my sort of kind of system at the moment, where I'm sort of little kind of asterisks about the images that I want to go back to and spend time with. But it's probably a 10-year project.
Rerouting. I mean, I can see that a couple more or questions come in from Brenda, who's asking about how you incorporate the haptic and tacit side of the archive in your outcomes.
Yeah, great question. It's not something I've done yet, but it's something that I want to do. I mentioned earlier about wanting to involve other people, so there will be that will be explored in some ways, whether it's asking people to I'm not quite, actually I can't really answer that yet, but that will be something I will be exploring. I'm just trying to find a way to go beyond kind of most obvious side of it, which initially I was thinking of getting people to respond to some of the menus that are within the Chelt volumes. So it might be food-based. Yeah, I like the idea of kind of looking at a photograph and trying to photograph smell. So working backwards, could you work out what something smelled like? With some of the images, I'm looking for images of stillness and looking to kind of think about the sound of those. So it's a great question. It's something that's been there throughout, but I'm not sure I'm quite there yet. It's yeah. Next blog entries, it will be there.
I wonder if that might be a good point to thank Jean and Louise for a fascinating and insightful discussion. I love that idea that you're going to be categorizing stains and the occult from the Chelt volumes. That's incredible.
It needs to be done.
So there has been a recording made of this session, and that will be available on the Hardwick Gallery website in the next week or so. Thank you to everyone for turning up this evening. Thank you for your questions. Do check out the ongoing and updating blog on the residency part of the Hardwick Gallery website. I think you tend to be updating every week, or sometimes
it's been a bit
more often.
It's been a bit slow to going, but now it will be every week. So
brilliant.
Yeah,
thank you. So yeah, thank you everyone, and keep safe, and we'll say goodbye.
And thank you so much to Jean and Sarah. Thank you. And Peter.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Jean.